So if there is anybody on the line that wishes to give public comment for things that we're not discussing tonight, please raise your hand in the reactions and then unmute yourself. And we'll look at the screen to see if there are any hands raised. If the hand raising doesn't work, do some sort of reaction on there. On my screens, and I'm seeing I don't see anybody who wishes to speak, have public comment for things not being heard. So at this point, we will close that section of the meeting and look at the consent calendar. We have two things under consent. They are the minutes from June 2nd meeting and the minutes from June 16th. So if the planning commissioners have any additions, comments, deletions to those meetings, please speak up. If not, could somebody make a motion to approve the minutes?
I move that we approve the minutes.
I'll second.
Great. Steve, would you like to do a formal roll call for a minute approval?
Yes. Commissioner Ahi,
Yes.
Commissioner Roche,
Yes.
Commissioner Stanley,
Yes.
Vice Chair Messinger,
Yes.
and Chair Doran.
Yes.
And that passes.
Great. Okay. Now we come to discussion for item number 2, which is the discussion regarding the status of the 6th cycle housing element 2023 to 2031, the public review draft. I'd like to ask our city attorney if she could talk to the commissioners about how we work. Some of us have conflicts of interest because we live within 500 feet of some of the sites. So if the city attorney could clarify to us how we are to approach that, and then if we could look ourselves to see if we have a quorum for each one of these areas. Please do, Julie.
So since you and I talked today, I've been I spoke to Steve and Nick, the community development director, and we believe that at this time it is going to be a high-level general discussion, and we won't be talking about specific sites. But if we're going to be coming back and discussing specific sites, then we need to make sure that conflict issues are addressed at that point. And I don't know, Nick, do you want to add anything to that? Because I know we were trying to figure out if we were going to have to segment, which for the members of the public, if someone has a conflict, they would recuse themselves. There would be a discussion and some sort of determination, and then the conflicted person would come back in. But I don't think we're going to be at that level of review tonight. I think tonight is just high level policy. And so we won't have to worry about it, but the final housing element, we will have to look at that. And did I summarize that correctly, Nick? I think that's where we were thinking it was going to stay tonight.
Yeah, I think that's the best course of action. Also, I want to just remind the commissioners is that this item is not by any means done or adjourned essentially at the close of this meeting. This public comment period is open until July 24th. So if we need to work with you individually on a case-by-case basis because of potential conflicts due to ownership of properties adjacent to specific sites, you can consult with myself and the city attorney after this meeting, and then you can provide your feedback in writing and correspondence for this particular item. So there are multiple different avenues that we can take in order to make sure that any particular issues that you need to raise are, made known. We don't want to make sure that we don't violate anything this evening during this discussion, as Jolie mentioned, is supposed to be a high-level discussion programmatically of what the housing element has, gain some feedback from based on some of the public comments, but site-specific things we really should avoid trying to talk about if you do potentially have a conflict. But obviously we can address that on a case-by-case basis if you think you may have something specific to each site that might be mentioned by the public or a member of the commission.
So then, just to clarify, generally, if there's a comment from one of the commissioners relative to an area, we can talk about that area and not have to recuse ourselves if it's an area that's within our boundaries, or we should just not do that tonight. We should just take our comment from the public and be silent on those areas which affect us.
The latter of your statement is what course of action I would recommend
Okay.
for you to
Just
take this evening.
Want to be clear.
And again, we can fold back in and build those comments in if we feel that it's appropriate for you to be able to make
Okay.
a formal comment in writing after this meeting.
Okay. Then procedure right now, would you like to present the staff report to us, please? And to the public?
Yeah, sorry, something just flew in my eye right when you said that. Yes, I'm actually going to turn it over to our consultants with Lisa Weiss Consulting, or
Great.
LWC, as you might see some of their names on the screen. Not sure how everybody has themselves notated. And I believe David is actually going to start us off, correct? Or is it going to be Stefano? Yeah, so David's going to unmute himself and he's going to be able to be the one to start us off. And David, were you guys able to have the PowerPoint open? Otherwise, I have it and I can share it.
Whatever works best for you. I have it open, but it might be easier for us to for me to say next slide and move on.
Okay,
That way.
yep.
You'll all work. So if you can throw up the first slide, which is the cover slide, and make sure that everything's working correctly.
Steve, it says that you actually have disabled participants screen sharing.
Try now.
Okay, I got it. Thank you.
You gotta change drivers.
Yep.
Terrific. Yeah, that's
All right.
That's the opening here. Well, terrific. And thank you so much. We're really pleased to be here presenting to the City of Los Altos Planning Commission. This work on the housing element, the update for the city's housing element has been the result of a tremendous amount of collaboration between the community, elected appointed officials, and professional staff on the city's team. And it's been a lot of work. And we've gotten to a point where the public review draft has been circulating, and we are asking for your further input as the Planning Commission and as community leaders to understand some of the nuances and some of the particularities of the housing element, so that the City Council can provide direction that it is submitted to the State of California's Department of Housing and Community Development for its first review. Just go to the next slide. Just a few quick introductions on the team. Again, Nick, who has been fantastic. He's been joining us as the third Development Services Director in this process after Guido and Laura filled in, and we really have come to appreciate Nick's experience and expertise, having guided several housing elements in the sixth cycle to adoption. It's great to have someone who has the kind of experience and insight on the team as well. John Maginot from the City Manager's Office has provided us with a tremendous amount of continuity while there's been this change, and has really been a strong leader for the voice of the community and the city as a corporation through this process. Sonia is the Public Information Officer, who's been a critical partner again in this process, because outreach, which has been extensive, is such an important part of the housing element update process. So again, my name is Dave Bergman. I'm a director at Lisa Wise Consulting. I've been working on this housing element along with 16 other housing elements in the 6th cycle here across the entire state, in regions from Sacramento to Santa Barbara to Southern California to the Bay Area. Our firm is actually very proud of our record right now, having the city of Los Angeles just had its housing element certified by HCD. So now the entire SCAG region with 191 jurisdiction now has 18 certified. We have 2 of them, including one of 4 that were certified before the deadline. So we feel good about our ability to understand the changing requirements that have come from the 6th cycle. Jen Murillo, who is the project manager, also a colleague director at the firm. She's not available tonight, but will be at the city council presentation. I'm going to be joined by Stefano Riccici, who is a lead associate on the project, and he'll talk a little bit more when we get into some of the sites issues. Plan to Place has been our contract partner on the outreach process. And we're joined by Paul and Rachel from their office today. Paul and Rachel, along with their principal, Dave Javid, have been responsible for a number of the outreach efforts in support with Sona and the city team. So that's who the team you have working on this project. If we can go to the next slide, please. I'll give you a quick outline of the topics that we hope to cover, or that we intend to cover in this presentation, which is a quick overview of the housing element. Many of you on the Planning Commission, of course, are closely familiar with it, but it's a difficult and new topic that can be technically overwhelming to members of the general public, some of whom might be just tuning in for the first time today. So we want to make sure that we provide a little bit of background on that. We are then going to talk about the sites inventory. The sites inventory plays an important role, but not a dispositive role in the housing element. Many times communities really focus on the sites inventory as being the whole ball game, if you will. If I can mix metaphors, the sites inventory is the playing field, or the board that shows that the city has the capacity to meet its statutorily required housing goals or allocation that has been set by the state. Importantly, just as importantly, that comes along with it, which are the goals, policies, and programs. Those are the implementation steps that the city will commit itself to over the 8 years of the planning cycle. So the goals, policies, and the programs in particular, are really the steps and implementation tools that the city will use to implement the housing element. We'll talk a little bit about the process and some next steps, and then finally we'll have questions and comments from the commission. They'll be directed through to staff, and if there are opportunities for the consultants to amplify, staff will let us know. And then, as a noticed public meeting, there is the opportunity for the community to make comments. So if we can go to the next slide. So talk a little bit about the housing element in general and the outreach. So this is the first of our 5 topics. The housing element is a required component of a city's general plan. It's interesting in that all general plans, every city or county in the state has to have a general plan, and there are certain mandated sections. You have to have a land use element, you have to have a circulation element, you have to have a noise element, you have to have a public safety element. Housing and how the community will meet its requirements and obligations to accommodate growth and house its population is a mandated section of every community's general plan. unlike other general plan elements, it's very highly regulated, and it needs to be found in substantial compliance with state law by the California Department of Housing and Community Development, which is a unit of the executive branch of the state government. So unlike other other elements of your general plan where you have a lot of creativity in what you can consider, the housing element is very tightly constrained as to what must be included and how it needs to reflect the mandates of government code. Go to the next slide, please. So all housing elements need to have these components, and we will be talking about those, but this structure is the structure of the document that has been circulated, the public review draft, and in the packet that the commission received. So there's a housing element document, and then underneath it there are components, usually in the form of appendices, that talk about these issues. One is a housing needs assessment. That's essentially an overview of the conditions in the community of both the housing stock and its demographic conditions. Constraints to the development of housing. This is an analysis of 3 interrelated areas. Some are governmental constraints. These are issues in your development code or in your zoning code that are inhibiting the development of housing. They need to be identified and mitigated. Then there are non-governmental constraints. Those non-governmental constraints are mostly about market conditions, lending, things that are out of the local government's control, but may represent constraints to the production of housing. Thirdly, there are environmental conditions. Those can include issues of topography and site conditions in a community, but can also include brownfields or other circumstances in the environment that inhibit housing development. Then there's a review of the existing programs that the city has had. Now remember, this is the 6th cycle housing element. Every 8 years, communities need to undertake these. These go back to the late 1960s. So the state is interested in tracking what the progress of every community has been towards the commitments it makes towards programs. Housing resources. Housing resources points to the financial and implementation tools that are available to the jurisdiction. Those include local programs, but also countywide, state, and even federal programs that can help fund and encourage the production of housing, in particular income qualified or affordable housing. Finally, the next there is an analysis of a site's inventory and the method to determine them. This is the question of whether or not the city has the capacity under its existing land use controls and zoning to accommodate the housing that has been assigned to it through its regional housing needs allocation. New to the 6th cycle is a mandate to affirmatively further fair housing and an assessment of each community's efforts and development of programs to guarantee fair access for housing for protected classes. Protected classes are identified in the government code beyond just race and ethnicity, which is an important factor in fair housing, but also looking at seniors, populations with disabilities, both mental and physical disabilities, large families, and female-headed households with children present. So those are the protected classes where where every community needs to have programs to affirmatively further access to housing for these protected classes. Finally, they're the goals, policies, and programs that are the commitments that the city will make towards meeting its allocation or its goals for the provision of housing over the next 8 years. Next slide, please. A quick recap of outreach. Outreach is a critical component of the housing element process. The state requires a diligent effort in public outreach. which is the highest standard. So as I say, it's not just a good idea to have public outreach because it makes for better plans, it's also the law. So we began public outreach projects in the end of 2021. There were a number of pop-up events that were led by city staff. And we also held focus group meetings where the consultant met with key stakeholders for more in-depth interviews about the issues that they were facing with housing. If you go to the continued slide, which is where you are, we also, the city led over 25 group meetings from January to March of this year with over 120 participants, speaking with different neighborhood community organizations within Los Altos, trying to speak to as many people as possible, hearing a diverse range of opinions and try and understand as much as possible. Also, materials were translated into Spanish and simplified Chinese, and a Spanish language interpreter was present at the second community workshop. Then there was also a workshop with the Planning Commission held back in February to discuss opportunities and constraints for facilitating housing. Go to the next slide, please. Slide 9 on affirmatively furthering fair housing, because in addition to the general requirement for outreach to the community, targeted outreach needs to occur towards these protected classes, towards individuals and towards organizations that represent or have contact, provide services with, or interface with members of these protected classes. So the city, working with the city, but the city really took the lead on this, sent letters to over 200 local and regional contacts to encourage conversations with staff to discussing housing challenges and concerns. These were multilingual, Spanish, simplified Chinese were used, asking for input on the housing element update, looking at community organizations, schools, the community college, advisory groups, providers of fair housing organizations, the county housing authority, as well as local employers. Go to the next slide, please. Again, trying to make certain that we meet those requirements for affirmatively furthering fair housing and that targeted outreach. Questionnaires were distributed to employers in English and Spanish to solicit work for feedback from the local workforce, which may or may not live in the city. On-site engagement, including feedback forms that were available at the Los Altos housing.org website. Postcard mailers were sent to all residents, direct mailings to service providers, and importantly, street banners, which I hope many of you saw. Justifiably, the city did a fantastic job of trying to make people aware of the importance of this process. And then window cards that were distributed to businesses at Los Altos. So if we can go on next to the next slide, which is the site inventories, I'll let my colleague Stefano take over, and he'll talk a little bit about what the site's inventory is, go a little bit over the map of sites, again, that has been included in the public review draft, and explaining what's implied by those maps, helping to interpret them.
Thanks, David. Thank you, Chair and Planning Commissioners and everyone who's attended today. I'm Stefano Rikiki, Lead Associate with LWC. As David mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit about the site's inventory. For those of you who have looked at the public review draft, this is Appendix B in the public review draft available online at losaltoshousing.org. Next slide, please, Nick. So what is the housing element sites inventory? You've heard us talk in the past a lot about RENA. And so the housing element sites inventory looks at how the city is or is not meeting its RENA. As we'll see on in a few slides, the city is real close in meeting its regional housing needs allocation. And there are different programs that David will talk about later on in the presentation to discuss kind of how we're going to get, all the way there, how we're going to get to the finish line in terms of meeting the city's RHNA. Of course, we received a lot of feedback and comments, different concerns throughout this process. It's important to clarify that property owners are not required to build the projected number or affordability of the units identified in the site's inventory. So your property or a neighbor's property may be identified on the site's inventory. That fact doesn't mean that the property owner has to do anything with the property. Again, this is just showing the city's capacity for meeting its RHNA obligations. Another thing that's come up and people have asked about is whether or not the city needs to obtain property owner approval for inclusion of a property in the site's inventory, and that's not the case. So that the city does not have to get property owner approval to identify a property as a site. And then in terms of programs, there are different rezoning and zoning amendment programs that David will talk about later on. These are all adopted by ordinance. And so it's just your typical zoning ordinance amendment process that the city will have to go through subsequent to the housing element, and people will have a chance to chime in and to provide input at that time as well, in addition to during this housing element update process. Also, consistent with state law, the city's going to encourage and facilitate the production of housing at all income levels. We'll touch on the different income levels in a little more detail here as we move through the presentation. And all of this approach that we've taken in preparing the sites inventory follows technical guidance from HCD. Next slide, please, Nick. So this table, again, this is in Appendix B of the housing element, the sites inventory and methodology appendix. This table shows the RHNA, or the city's obligation, broken down by income category. So it's almost 2,000 units that the city has to plan for and show that it has the capacity to accommodate for, over the next 8 years during this 6th cycle. And so there are several kind of ingredients that go into meeting RHNA, several different components. One of them, accessory dwelling units. So we take the applications and the building permits that have been issued for accessory dwelling units over the last several years, and we project those out throughout the 6th cycle. And so those are those ADU numbers you see there broken down into the different income categories. Then we have pipeline projects. Those are projects that are currently in the process there with the city. And so there are hundreds of units that are proposed currently in the city's pipeline as well. So we take the ADUs and the pipeline projects, and we just subtract those from the RHNA to see what the city has to meet in terms of its sites. What's the capacity that the city has to show in terms of sites there? We'll talk about vacant and non-vacant sites. The city is, largely built out, so there aren't a whole lot of vacant sites. And so there are certain methodologies and assumptions that you have to make when including non-vacant sites. And that's largely what the city and what we have done is include non-vacant sites to meet this RHNA. Another question that's come up a lot is, what about SB9? Why don't we include SB9? Unlike ADUs, most cities don't have a track record of demonstrating SB9 unit production. And so because of that, we've had conversations with HCD. There has been guidance from HCD to be very careful and to generally not include SB9 units unless your city has a track record of permitting those, or unless there are SB9 applications in your pipeline as well. And so that's why we are not including SB9 consistent with HCD guidance. And then as you can see here toward the bottom of the table, we have the estimated RHNA surplus and shortfall shown given the existing capacity. And you can see there's a very small buffer for the lower income income category and the moderate income category. There's a slight shortfall in above moderate as well. So again, this table shows what the city's capacity is under its current zoning regulations, under its current general plan land use designations. And you can see that the city is almost there. There's not too much of a buffer there in those income categories, and we do have that shortfall in above moderate. So we'll see as we move through this how the rezoning really bumps those numbers up and strengthens the city's position. Next slide, please, Nick. So the sites map is generating here, or it did generate. I don't know if you all can see that now.
And, Nick, you might have to hit the button again. There's an animation.
Thanks, David.
There we go.
We were getting tricky with our animations here. So anyway, this is just a general map of the city showing different sites broken down by income category. The green, you can see the legend there toward the bottom. Green is above moderate sites. That tan is moderate, blue is lower income sites. And then the crosshatched, which you can't really see on this map, we'll get into more zoomed in maps here on the next few slides, show rezone sites as well. So what this map is showing basically is just the distribution, just to give you a sense of the distribution of sites throughout the city. You know, we've got a lot along El Camino Real, we've got a lot in downtown, Foothill Expressway as well, and Loyola Corners, just different parts of the cities. This is the different parts of the city, excuse me. This is the citywide map, just to give you an idea generally of where the sites are located. Next slide, please. So here in the northern part of the city along El Camino Real, you can see that there are a lot of lower income sites. A lot of this is in the CT zoning district.
Stefano, if I can just also clarify something and interrupt real briefly.
Sure.
Understand that density is a proxy indicator of these income categories. So it says what is the possibility or the capacity of the site to accommodate lower income housing. In Los Altos's case, as an urbanized community, sites that are between 1/2 acre and 10 acres and have a density per acre of 30 units or more are considered to be eligible and count towards your lower production of lower income units. Likewise, with moderate and above moderate, your density is a proxy indicator, right? So all sites that are zoned for residential development between 20 and 29 units per acre are in that moderate category, and those that are less than 20 dwelling units per acre are above moderate. Okay, this is again about capacity, and that's an important thing to keep in mind, that density is the proxy indicator of income level in the HCD guidance and in the California Housing Elements System.
Thanks, David. Yeah, all these income levels, like David said, correlate to the different densities shown there in the legend. And so, yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about that here as we move along as well. You can see there are many sites there in the Sherwood specific plan as well. And then something to note, because we're going to move through these maps here pretty quickly. These are online at losaltoshousing.org as well. For anyone who's interested to look at them in greater detail. Next slide, please, Nick. So moving a little further down, a little further south in the city, you can see downtown has a lot of above moderate and moderate sites, as well as other sites in the vicinity. Later on, David will talk about programs and programs to modify zoning to promote residential use and residential capacity. And so that's a lot of what's shown on the east side of San Antonio. Most, if not all of those parcels are zoned OA office administrative. And so the map shows those as rezone sites as well. Next slide. Then as we move along, southern portion of the city, you can see that Loyola Corners, there are several sites there. And when I say rezone sites, you know, in some of these cases, the zoning isn't changing. It's the development standards that are being modified within that zoning district. And then there are other sites shown here as well. Next slide. And then last but not least, kind of the southern tip of the city has some above moderate, well, it has all different income categories shown here as well, a lot along Foothill. Next slide. So that just kind of gives you an idea of the distribution of sites throughout the city. David talked about some of this earlier on. There's different criteria that we use and criteria that are accepted by the California Department of Housing and Community Development in terms of whether or not a specific parcel can be counted a site for the purposes of the site's inventory. And so a big question is, are there impediments to development, right? So number one, right off the bat, does the parcel zoning allow for residential use? That's a pretty obvious one. This is, you know, the housing element that we're talking about. We're talking about showing capacity for dwelling units, for residential units. So right off the bat, you know, we sift through that and look at the different zoning districts that allow for residential use, including mixed use zoning districts. Then is the parcel vacant or underutilized if non-vacant? So as most of you probably know, there's not a whole lot of vacant land in Los Altos. And so what we're looking at more so is underutilized parcels in the city. And so what does underutilized mean? Well, there are some standards that are accepted by HCD that include the improvement to land value. And so basically if the improvements or the buildings on the parcel are less than the value of the land, then that's an indicator that this property may be underutilized. And then the age of the buildings and the structures, if they were built before 1980, they're over 40 years old now, there may be some interest, market interest in redevelopment there. Other screening criteria have to do with whether the parcel isn't already an existing residential use. You know, we don't want to double count capacity if there are already residential units on a parcel. Is there a park, utility, school, other public use? We're very careful about trying not to include parks, schools, other kind of sensitive uses as well. And then lastly here on the slide, we check for infrastructure, other site conditions that would disqualify the site. So you may get an assessor parcel number, you may get a parcel that is a street that comes through, or an easement or something like that comes through the screening. Well, then we look and see, okay, no, you know, that's not going to be built upon. Maybe there are environmental conditions, very steep slope, you know, that would make it infeasible to develop housing on a particular parcel. And so those kinds of things are considered impediments to development, and then we remove those as sites. They're not considered sites any longer. Next slide. David also talked about some of this a little bit earlier as well. So there are the various different income categories and the proxies that we use. Density being that maximum density being that proxy. And so for Los Altos and other metropolitan areas within the state, the thresholds are what David described earlier, that 30 dwelling units per acre or more. For lower income sites, 20 to 29 dwelling units per acre, moderate income sites, and 20 dwelling units or less for above moderate income sites. You'll also notice that there are particular parcel sizes that are shown here on the screen. And this is consistent with the California Government Code, state law, HCD guidance, all of that. So for lower income sites, we're only looking at sites that are 1/2 acre to 10 acres in size. And then for the above moderate income sites that are really small, it's hard for developers to pencil these out. Sites that are less than 1/4 acre for anything other than, above moderate or market rate in income levels. So that gets at the income categories. In terms of realistic capacity, generally we calculate that by discounting the maximum density or average development trend by zoning district. And so that discount, we're using 70% of the maximum density or average development trend. And that's very standard and accepted by HCD. Now, in terms of the CT district, we have seen in the pipeline applications come in that have higher proposed densities. And so we've bumped that up to 80% of the maximum density in the CT commercial thoroughfare zoning district along Camino Real. And so the idea with a lot of this is having conservative projections and projections that are going to be accepted by the state. And so, we don't want to project, say, 100% or over 100% of the maximum density or, of course, average development trend that's shown. And I've mentioned this is consistent with HCD guidance. So next slide. Okay, so we had earlier looked at the table that showed residential development capacity without the rezoning, right? What Los Altos's current zoning districts allow for. Now these numbers have changed here. This is showing with rezoning. And so when David gets into the different programs that the city is proposing here in a minute, you'll see that there are some amendments proposed to the CT district to facilitate housing. The office administrative district currently does not allow for housing. And so if the city opens that up, the OA district to allow for housing, then we get more capacity. There are a couple site zone PCF that have some capacity in the parking lots, site zone CN. So anyway, David will get into those programs in greater detail, but that's where these numbers are coming from, is some of the rezoning, the upzoning, the zoning modifications that'll happen. So in terms of the net change with rezoning, there are 600 units that we can project, 408 of those being in the lower income category. You can see the rest on the screen, 128 in moderate income, 64 in above moderate. So you may recall on a prior slide, the city had a very small buffer in the lower income category and moderate income category. Now those numbers have been bumped up with the rezoning to have over 50% buffers in those income categories. Now, in the above moderate income category, we don't have a tremendous buffer on account of rezoning, but something to note is that units can be shifted from the lower and moderate income categories to bolster the buffer in above moderate. The state in California HCD isn't so much worried about, you need to show capacity, but the state isn't as concerned with market rate housing. In this country, and probably most, if not all others, usually housing comes in at market rate. So that's not a big deal here. So next slide, please. So something to talk about is no net loss. And so those healthy buffers that we've seen with rezoning for the lower and moderate income categories, this is particularly useful and beneficial for the city when it comes to no net loss. What that means is throughout the throughout the 8 years of the housing element cycle from 2023 to 2031, if a site develops at lower capacity than anticipated in the housing element, then the city has to account for those units elsewhere. And so what this gives you with this buffer that's shown in the lower and moderate income categories is gives the city some breathing room in case everything doesn't go, according to plan, and in case the market bears out something a little bit different. Well, this gives some cushion here. So the rezone program, there are multiple rezone programs as part of the kind of comprehensive rezone program, but must address the RHNA capacity shortfall. Like I mentioned earlier, the only shortfall the city has now is in the above moderate income category. And so that's what the rezone program is addressing, as well as facilitating housing and facilitating this buffer. So I think that's it for me. I'm going to turn it back over to David here. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefano. If we can go to the next slide, we'll talk about policies, goals, policies, and programs, which really make up the bulk of the housing element itself. That information is in sort of what we refer to as the main body document in your packet and in the public review draft. That's the housing element and not the supporting statistical appendices. So a lot of the discussion of sites was in Appendix B, and there are other appendices that correspond to the required topics, but the housing plan is in the main body document. So next slide, please. So the housing plan, which is section 4 of the housing element itself, is the city's strategy for addressing its housing needs, because as we saw in the sites inventory, the city's general plan and existing zoning under land use does have room for additional growth in housing and at a pretty high density. But in order to see affordable housing developed rather than market rate housing on all of the sites, programs and policies need to be put in place to help guide and encourage the development of housing at all income levels. Let's go to the next slide, please. So to summarize the goals, and the goals, by the way, also have quantified objectives. And the quantified objectives are targets that are measured against the annual report, annual progress report. Now, some of you may be familiar, others may not be, that every year every city in California reports to HCD its annual progress towards its goals under the regional housing needs allocation. So how it's meeting its obligations, and progress towards its goals in the form of quantified objectives. It's get reported on every year in public documents that are provided to the state. So quantified objectives have been included where relevant for programs, and these are measurable targets that can be used to benchmark the success of each program. So there's 7 main goals: to promote new housing construction, to meet the city's obligation under RHNA, to facilitate affordable housing and to accommodate the needs of moderate and lower income households. So that, again, facilitate that production of below market rate housing, to remove constraints from the development of housing, to create opportunities for housing for persons with special needs, to conserve and improve the city's existing housing stock, to meet the goals of fair housing, and to encourage energy and resource conservation and sustainability. Next slide, please. So what are the key programs in meeting the RHNA obligation? Again, we saw that there is between the pipeline, between the forecasted, the safe harbor method for forecasting accessory dwelling units based on the city's past performance going back to 2018. There is a shortfall in above. And remember, when we talk about the shortfall in above, that does not mean that unassisted, the low income sites will develop as 100% low income housing. What that means is that those are sites that have the capacity, that meet that density requirement, that allow them to be classified. But that nevertheless means the city has to have programs to support the production of housing at below market rates. So program number one is to rezone for the shortfall. That will have to be completed within 3 years of January 15th, 2023. So by January 15th, 2026, provided everything stays on time and that the housing element is certified and adopted before the 120-day grace period that begins on January 15th, 2023. So to May 15th, 2023. So that if that doesn't happen, then that compresses to a year. There's a program to facilitate higher density in the CT district to allow for more units per acre, again, to encourage the possibility for mixed income development on that very high valued and expensive land. To allow housing as an allowable use in the office administrative district. And to allow housing on certain public and community facilities districts, particularly 2 large church sites, parking lots along Foothill or adjacent to Foothill Expressway. This program actually is to allow those churches to take advantage of changes in state law that allow for religious institutions, which very often as part of their charitable activities are interested in providing affordable housing or senior housing or housing for protected classes as part of their charitable efforts. We've looked at the space that's available on their parking lots that parking would not need to be reproduced as a result of changes in state law. A recommendation to update the Loyola Corners specific plan and remove the cap of 20 units in the entire specific plan area. There is an odd circumstance in Village Court where there's a split between an underlying commercial and residential parcel. The development is operating under a special purpose zoning planned unit development circumstance that would need to be re-examined in order to allow the village court to develop as mixed use or residential mixed use development. To work to facilitate housing on city-owned land, particularly on parking lots that have been identified by the downtown vision plan as potential sites for residential development. And finally, to incentivize downtown lot consolidation because larger lots facilitate housing development. And once you're over that quarter-acre threshold, it may be even able to support some below market rate housing because you get economies of scale. Next slide, please. Programs for goal number 2 is to support the production of affordable housing. So this is to continue to implement and enhance the city's inclusionary housing requirements. Also a program to establish an affordable housing in lieu fee, which is required for multifamily, but not required for single family in state law. So that would be an affirmative step that the city could take to extend that option for an in lieu fee to single family development. And commercial linkage fee, development of a commercial linkage fee. To continue its efforts in assisting to fund affordable housing projects and to encourage and streamline accessory dwelling units. Now, one thing I want to say, and this is probably really true for the goal 1 when we talked about those zoning changes, the housing element does not change the zoning, right? The housing element creates a program that commits the city to looking at what the zoning can be in the future. Those changes to the zoning code would be adopted by ordinance by the city. So the community can be anticipated and is encouraged to help articulate what the details of those zoning changes are in terms of things like objective design standards, height, bulk, setbacks, all the kinds of things that are discussed whenever a zoning change occurs. So adoption of the housing element just means that the zoning code and these zoning issues will be opened, but it doesn't determine the specificity or the particular wording or characteristics of any ordinance. Likewise, with a program like an in lieu fee or a commercial linkage fee, this does not establish what those fees would be. There would need to be a public process. Go to the next slide here for goal 3, which is to remove constraints, prepare a downtown parking plan, and again, update parking requirements to make it a little more efficient, opening up land for residential development, modifying building heights in mixed-use zone districts. Again, some of the height restrictions are impediments for development of housing. There's certain site-specific FAR restrictions that are carve-outs or are different from its underlying zone. Those serve as constraints for the production of housing. Going back and making sure that the city's density bonus ordinance, and in fact, all of its ordinances are consistent with state law. A need to reduce conditional use permit requirements for residential, mixed use, and multifamily. Again, some of that is there are places in the city's existing development standards that are not fully aligned with state requirements. Recommendation to amend conditional use permit findings applicable to housing development, and amend the design review process and requirements, again, congruent with your objective design standards and congruent with the requirements of state law for objective design standards and design review in housing projects. Go to number 4. Accommodate special needs, which is to continue and expand support for funding homeless services. Allow low barrier navigation centers, again, to make the code consistent with AB 101 and state law. So these are modernization tasks
just
that
a
need to be
quick-
undertaken. Yeah.
Quick interjection. Do we need the next slide here on this one?
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Goal 4. Thank you for catching that. Reasonable accommodations for persons with disabled housing. Also looking at programs to assist seniors for rehabilitation and maintenance of their housing, and looking for possibility of additional density bonuses for housing that accommodates specified classes and special needs groups. Next slide, please. Goal 5, which is to conserve housing, which is to keep track of condominium conversions, making sure that any condominium conversions that do occur are, again, undertaken in congruence with state law. Very oftentimes tenants aren't aware of what their protections are, and making sure that that information is available. Continue to work with the Alta Housing to administer the city's affordable housing programs. So these are in place. These programs are in place to preserve and expand. Look at ways to limit commercial uses from displacing residential housing where possible. Incentivize the creation of play areas for in multi-family housing projects. Again, this creates a more habitable space for families and large families, and it's something that actually was discussed in our public outreach as an important or innovative component that can be added to Los Altos' housing development standards that are both humane and supportive of the needs of a protected class, and to help to ensure a high quality of multifamily development. Go to program 6, please, the next slide. Fair housing programs, again, are a requirement from the state on affirmatively furthering fair housing. So looking at assisting residents with housing discrimination and helping to intervene in landlord-tenant complaints to help mediate those. Maintain and expand an inventory of affordable housing funding sources. Again, looking at opportunities to encourage the development of affordable units in the highest resource areas of the city. Generally speaking, Los Altos is a very high resource area community from there's classifications that come from the tax credit allocation. So adding new affordable housing in Los Altos is generally adding housing in high resourced areas. Promote housing choice, rental assistance, help to educate information about anti-displacement and tenants' rights, and affirmatively market physically accessible units for disabled population and senior population. Let's go to the next program. So 7, looking at energy conservation. Again, this is a state mandate, promote energy and water conservation and greenhouse gas reduction through education and awareness campaigns, monitor and implement statutory requirements of climate change legislation. So there are a number of state mandates related to energy conservation and climate change that impact housing. And the city needs to be committed to monitoring and implementing whatever changes come from state law. Next slide, please. So the implementation of these programs are key. This is, again, if the sites inventory is the playing field, the implementation is done through the programs. They're not independent of each other. They're interdependent, and they're very important. Programs such as rezoning, as I mentioned, or any other programs that require amendments to the city's development standards undergo the same zoning ordinance amendment process that includes public hearings and input, right? So although this is a statement of your goals and objectives, the details of the development standards, how they will be fully articulated in the code, will go through a public hearing process. So things like allowable height, setbacks, massing, and the objective design standards are going to be worked out through a zoning ordinance amendment. And hopefully we get this all certified in time, and you have 3 years to do this by January of 2026, and it doesn't get compressed into 1 year if you miss the deadline. So we're working really hard with your community to meet this deadline. I know it sounds strange. We're talking about January of 2023. It's July. Why does it take so long? We'll talk a little bit about that when we go to the next slide on processes and next steps. So go to the next slide, please. Let me give you this. This is our timeline. So last October, the state legislature changed the review process. We were either under contract with Los Altos or just about to get under contract with Los Altos when this change happened. And one of the changes is that the state gives itself 90 days to review the housing element the first time. And then each subsequent revision is 30 days. So we want to move forward with this process so that we can get it into HCD. It also has to be circulated for the public review draft has to be circulated for 30 days prior to being sent to HCD. Each revision has to be circulated for 7 days in between the 30-day reviews. We're finding from our work in clients down south, usually it takes 2 reviews. Some circumstances, it'll take 3. It depends on the experience of your reviewer. It depends on certain conditions in your community. The requirements are complex and sometimes conflicting, so it looks a little capricious to the outside whether you get it done the first time or the second time or a third time. As I mentioned, our experience in Southern California should be used as a guide for you, that out of the 191 jurisdictions in the Southern California region, there are, as of today, 18 with certified housing elements. Again, our firm composed 2. And of those 18, only 5, and our firm composed 1, were certified prior to the deadline. So.
And Dave, real quick, that the first round of HCD review is 90 days, and then the second round and beyond, I think, are 60 days each.
60 days, correct. Sorry, 60 days. If I said 30 days, those were the old rules. It's now 60 days. So we lose time automatically while the state is reviewing it. But there will be more opportunities for input, and your input is of course encouraged, not just today, not just at the council meeting, not just during the first review, but through the entire process, all the way up through adoption in a public hearing by the city council. We really do want to hear from you. It does matter. And we do take public comments, not just when I say we, the entire team, city staff, elected and appointed officials, and of course the consultants do have a process and take those public comments very seriously. Go to the next slide, please. So the public review draft is circulated as 30 days. For 30 days as required by state statute. Public comments are invited during this time and throughout the entire process. Public comments are accepted after submission, all the way through final adoption of the housing element by the city council after HCD's notice of substantial compliance. That's the so-called certification. The state does not certify an unadopted housing element. Does not really certify. It sends you a letter that says on their review, if you adopt this ordinance as written or this plan as written, it is in substantial compliance with state law, with relevant state law. Next steps. Please go to the next steps. So public meetings, again, will continue a city council hearing on July 12th. And again, any information we hear from that will lead to a revision and submission of the housing element HCD review. Revise the housing element in light of any HCD comments. There will always be comments on that first submission. Then go through a process of public hearing for adoptions. The deadline for certification and adoption is January 15th with a grace period that goes till May. Briefly, again, go to the next slide. It's worth talking about some of the penalties for non-compliance. They can be, as I mentioned before, a requirement to do the rezoning to meet your RENA requirement within 1 year as opposed to 3 years. And then you fall out of compliance. There's financial penalties that can come to a community, city exposure to a lawsuit for which it will be responsible for paying litigants' attorney fees, and including the state, which has a housing element enforcement unit that has been created by the Attorney General's office. A loss of access to state funding sources, including transportation funding, SB1 grants, and other regional transportation funding. And in extreme cases, loss of permitting authority and a receivership of the city's land use authority. That's an extreme condition, but we do want to put it out there that it can happen when communities decide that they are going to resist rather than comply with state law. Please go to the next slide. So finally, again, we've said this a number of times and we really do mean it. We'd like you to stay informed and involved. There's a website specifically dedicated. I hope many of you have seen it already. If you haven't, please go to it and sign up for emails. And again, written comments can always be received at housingelement@losaltosca.gov. So with that, I'd like to turn it back to Nick and the commission for any questions or comments. And again, I thank you for your attention to this sometimes complicated and esoteric topic.
Let's see, Nick.
Yeah, so commissioners, at this time, this concludes the staff's kind of portion of the presentation, and kind of really want to open it up more for the public forum component of this meeting, because that's really what the heart and root of this meeting is intended for, is to gain commissioner comments and also comments from the public in order to be able to really help steer the development of this moving forward.
So we won't segregate the comments or questions from the commission. We'll just speak in order of public or commission. Or would you like us to segregate? Does the commission have any questions first and then move on to the public? I'll feign to your expertise on that.
Generally speaking, something like this, I think it's probably best organized to have the public kind of open up the door for that, because this is really kind of comment and just kind of free flowing a little bit.
Sure.
And then we can, that might also somewhat segue some of the questions that the commission might have as well.
Sure. And then Nick, will you be calling upon people to speak? Will that be your task tonight, your responsibility? Or how do we orderly have people speak?
So
The
Steve
platform.
is actually still on the call. So Steve will be the one that's still monitoring that as the staff liaison to the Planning Commission.
And what I'll do, if you open up the public comment, we'll ask people to raise their hands, and depending on the number of speakers, we'll give the appropriate amount of time. If there's a lot of public speakers, we'll just have to gauge the amount of time that we can give for each speaker. And also I can announce the next speaker and then the speaker after that. So when they're ready to speak, they can unmute themselves right away.
Sure. As a rule, I think we've been looking at if we have more than 10 speakers, we like to have 2 minutes apiece. Or does that sound fair?
That sounds reasonable to me. Yeah.
Reasonable. Okay, great. Thank you.
And if there's speakers that, generally have, if there's commenters and other individuals that have the same comment, they can just say, I have that same comment and keep it a little bit more brief.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, LWC, for your presentation. I will just make one comment for the future. We have so many people from the public on the call, and you had so much information. Sometimes people want to know, well, what does it mean for me and what is my time frame? So just think about that for your future presentations. Like if you're going to post on the website, what's their time frame to respond? How many days are left? Give people a countdown so they don't miss any question periods and nothing becomes closed. And what does it mean for them? But so at this point, I will just open up for public comment and turn it over to Steve Golden to call on members of the public. Please raise your hand in the reaction function. We have about 40 people on the call right now.
So we'll give people a minute so they can find that reaction. And it is helpful in us trying to organize the meeting if you can raise your hand now, if possible, so we know and we can gauge how much time to give to everybody.
Let's see.
Give
Hi.
it a couple more seconds here. I just only see 3 speakers, and
You.
I'm just looking also. I don't see any speakers on the phone for
Members of the public, if you'd like to comment, we would really encourage you to speak up.
So I'm gonna start in a second. Let me get my timer. I only see 4 speakers. So do you want to give, how much time would you like to give, Chair?
Yeah, 3 minutes are fine. This is a big topic.
Okay, I'm gonna start with just the person who's on the top, and I'll work my way down. So this first speaker I see on my screen is gonna be Roberta Phillips, followed by, sorry, it's just VINA. So Roberta, when you're ready, you can unmute yourself, and let me get my timer up on the share screen.
One other comment, we've received many letters at the Planning Commission, and Steve, they will be in the published, in our, on the Planning Commission website, so people can see the comments from the public that we've received previous to this meeting.
Yeah, the comments that have been received specifically for the Planning Commission meeting, we should be posting as late correspondence. I don't think that was done this afternoon yet, but they'll go as late correspondence to the meeting. There's also, Nick can chime in, anything that's going to the Los Altos housing element email address will also be included in the administrative record, but that's being handled by the consultant specifically.
Did I encourage the members of the public to please read what other residents have written to us? Thank you. Roberta, please go ahead.
Yes, hi. Hi, you can hear me?
Yep, yes.
Okay, great. So I, appreciate all the work that's going into it. I've attended all of the meetings so far, Ring Central and Zoom, etc. And I know that, this is something that we have to do. We have no choice. There are state laws. That being said, I do think that we want to keep as much local control as we can. I'm talking about tonight the OA district because I know you want to add housing either as a conditional use or as just add housing as like an overlay map. I think there's several ways you can go. I know you're not going to put it in the HCD report now, but I think we should start talking about the fact that those lots are not deep at all. They abut single family neighborhoods. And I would like to see, townhouses being built there. I'm concerned about, setting a height limit of 30 feet because we already know that if you have 30 feet, like we did on First Street, then it becomes 54 feet or 58 feet or 62 feet like it is on First Street in downtown right now. So I think that we need to figure out a way that we can have housing there that adds to the housing stock, but also respects the neighbors and the environment in that area. I know that, there's different possibilities. We do have, when you guys earlier this year worked on 140 Lyle, you use zoning standards of R3-1.8. You have Marshall Court. So we do have areas in the city where you can look at guidance that you have zoning on books or create zoning that is workable to keep the charm of our town. And I know that is subjective, not objective, but those lots are too small to be according to, what we just heard, according to Lisa Weiss, to be high density. So if they can't be high density, you might as well keep it so that they are townhouses or duplexes. And that would be very, very, very acceptable to the people who live in that area. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Roberta. Okay. Steve, who do you see next on your screen?
It's on mute. I have VINA followed by Daphne Ross. Followed by Daphne Ross.
Okay, hello. Yes, this is Maria, and I'm with VINA, Village Court Neighborhood Alliance. Are you able to
Oh,
hear me?
yeah, I'm sorry. Go right
Okay,
ahead.
no problem.
I hear you.
Okay, yeah, I want to make sure I just start
Absolutely.
properly. Okay, so I want to thank the commission for this thorough analysis and work, and I want to explain a few things that would be helpful in ensuring that this process is conducted with integrity and transparency, which is really important so that there aren't any misunderstandings on the path. So we have hosted city council members already and communicated our input with regard to Village Court. Also, we have a long history of communication with the city, Chris Jordan, and also prior management there in regard to what Village Court is. The zone of Village Court, majority of that is R1. And I want to point out that your maps, which are showing today, are incorrect again. So you must not proceed with this deliberation until the map is corrected. An email was sent to council already explaining how the map should be represented. So I ask formally that this map be reviewed again. What you are showing is a parcel tax map, which is not the zoning map. So if the intent is to indicate that you want to rezone an R1 zone, then we want clarity because that R zone is tied to Rilma Lane, and Rilma Lane is an R1. And so that R zone, per the ownership of that area when they put the PUD, was designed as a buffer for Rilma. So Rilma has never been annexed to any commercial. It is designed not to have that. Your map is incorrect. It has R1 all around it. So please make that distinction, because without that, it's going to create a lot of problems. So I urge you to either indicate to me, who's the right person to make that correction. The second point I want to say is we have a longstanding PUD, and it has always been defended. It's not a buried PUD, it's a live PUD. And there's residents here who've purchased homes in the $4.5 million range. And there is concern for how the city is going to conduct this process. So I think what we need to do is really come together and work together with the city to address the concerns that affect us all, including providing affordable housing. So I want to again extend our community here to speak to you about how we can work with you to find a solution that works within the limitations of what we have today. So thank you again, and please let me know whom to speak to about correcting the maps. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your comments.
Next, I have Daphne Ross, followed by John Bear.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thanks. Hello, I want to extend my support of the housing element draft and recognize all the work that has gone into it until this point from city staff, consultants, our electeds, and our commissioners. The document as it currently stands helps to push our city forward with programs that enable a future where we can house more people in a variety of ways. Our RHNA targets are ambitious, and this document shows that it can be done. In particular, I'd like to express support for Program 1H. The downtown parking plazas are ideal places for affordable housing, and I fully support the urgency indicated by outlining an RFP process by the end of 2023. I'd also like to express support for Program 1B, which is higher density in CT district. The El Camino corridor is where higher density and more height can be accommodated, and it is also closer to amenities and public transportation. This is already being done in Mountain View across El Camino, so I believe this makes complete sense. There are areas where the housing element can go further, including giving more specifics about parking solutions downtown. But overall, this draft looks very promising. So thank you.
Thank you, Daphne, and I appreciate your extensive survey of sites and your comments of each one of the zones. We really appreciate your information.
Next, I have John Bear, followed by Paul Baker. John.
Great, go ahead, John.
All right. So the city has a long history of encouraging development and balancing the needs and rights of those new developments with the needs and rights and privacy concerns of existing neighbors and residents. That's not always a simple process. It's not always straightforward, but certainly in my decade on the Planning Commission, I saw where that mutual respect and balance worked. I'm deeply, and somebody needs to correct that timer, please. I'm deeply disappointed that we have a housing element plan which seems to turn Los Altos and perhaps many other communities more into a little bit of the Wild West, where anything goes. And that to me is disappointing because all it does is create tension and conflict, which is not what we're looking for. We're looking for good housing developments. We're looking for good progress and a well-balanced community. And I think we're not going to achieve it with some of these plans and policies which ignore the existing residents and community and try and respect and balance varying needs. So that's my preamble. I'm going to make a specific comment with regard to the OA district. I will second the comments made by Roberta Phillips. This is an area that directly abuts residential. These are lots that are relatively shallow. They are in many cases half the length of lots along El Camino. And so finding appropriate level of development that respects the rights and light and privacy of the neighbors is really critical. And I would encourage there to be a OA with a housing overlay to protect those rights. I would encourage the city to open its parking plazas to the overflow parking because there simply isn't adequate parking along Hillview, Hawthorne, and Pepper. These are narrow streets, and there will be, these developments will by definition be underparked, and the city parking plazas across the street are ideal. One last comment, you know, people are encouraged to participate and comment, yet the reality is you have to comment at every meeting. And that's the fallacy of this process. You have to comment when they're collecting information. You have to comment at this meeting. You have to comment at the city council meeting. You have to comment at every possible meeting. And people are tired of it. And I think the way this has been presented has given people a false sense of the fact that they really need to be on top of this at every step. And that's asking an awful lot of residents. And I don't think that's necessarily fair. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. We appreciate your comments. Okay, next on the list, I see Paul Baker. Steve?
Okay, hi, it's Paul Baker. My comments are the housing plan is I think a good step forward. I think the goals of trying to have a more walkable, livable downtown area are wonderful. Really, the thing that I would add, and I actually did put a comment in on the website and sent a letter as well, relate to there's thought of adding housing to church parking lots, but it's really in the plan, it's really only 2 church parking lots. And there are a lot of churches in Los Altos and a lot of properties owned by churches in Los Altos that I think could be included in the plan as well. And I would like to see more, the opportunity for more churches to be involved in dealing with housing. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
I see another hand raised is Janine Valadez.
Hi there. Everybody can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Yes.
Great. Thank you. I want to thank everybody involved with creating this housing element draft. Tons of work, lots of detail. I really appreciated David's description of all the programs. They were very easy to follow. I think that the programs, as he said, are the key, and I support every single one of them. I live near Egan Middle School, house backs on San Antonio. I have a 1/3 of an acre, big lot, small house, big lot in a great cul-de-sac. And I fully recognize that housing is a shortage of major degree in our city. I fully expect that at some point in the future, there's going to be tall housing on the Egan site. I fully expect my neighbors, as they continue to tear down their old original houses and build new houses, that they're bigger and taller all around my single-story house. It is just a fact of life. I moved here 33 years ago. The city doesn't look the same, nor did I ever expect it to look the same 30 years from when I moved in. So I support the housing element. I support the programs. There are some topics I'd like to mention, though. One of my public comments that I made to the website very early in this process was about reaching out to workers, and I mean low-income workers, the workers that really are the backbone of everything that we do here in this city when it comes to delivering care, delivering food, selling food, cleaning the city. And I recognize that you said that you reached out to their employers, but I just don't know if that makes the same cut as actually reaching out to the workers. So I didn't see anything in the housing element so far that really satisfies my need there. The second thing is I would like to see increased focus on alternative forms of transportation in our city. If we're going to underpark housing, which I understand is a good thing, but we do need to give safe alternatives and encourage people with safe ways to store their bikes, with e-bike capabilities, with safe bike lanes, et cetera, et cetera. I also believe in charging people to park on streets if they don't live there. And we can use that as a source of revenue. It's a way to also incentivize people to use alternative forms of transportation. And finally, it is our duty to speak. Whether we speak once, twice, 100 times, it is our duty as citizens to speak. I encourage our fellow citizens to stay on top of this process. It's long, it's complex, but we do need to speak up. I don't like it when I hear people think of multifamily housing as non-residential. It is residential, and they deserve just as much right as our single family homes do. When you look at our site inventory and you just look at the aggregate of Los Altos, so very little of the city is going to be impacted by all of this housing. I mean, we're not touching it. So I really love the housing element. Thank you.
Thank you for speaking. I see another hand up. Kate Disney.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I don't have too much to say because I'm really looking at all of this for the very first time. So I have a lot of questions. But I just want to say that based on what I've heard so far, I do want to say that I really agree strongly with what Jonathan Baer has said. I really think that we've worked so hard to produce a pretty amazing city that is incredibly livable. And I feel so lucky to live here. And I just want to see that the new development is harmonious and represents, an appropriate next generation. I believe strongly that we should develop in a manner that does no harm to the existing residents, and that includes the R1. When looking at this plan, it feels a little bit like smoke and mirrors. It's like, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, but there's no details, right? Because what we're being presented with is kind of an abstraction. Like, we're going to develop this and we're going to do that, but the concrete development standards will come later when we do this rezoning. So I don't know how anyone can support this because it's an abstraction. Like, I would need to, for me to say I support this plan, I need to know, well, like in detail, what are the concrete changes to the zoning codes? Like you say 30 units or more. Well, 30 units per acre is a lot different than 50 units per acre. So I would say that what we need here is a lot more details, and rather than this abstraction of this is going to be upzoned, and we need to know upzoned to what? What are the development standards that are going to protect and buffer the existing residents? I'm very concerned that once you start getting into the details, it's going to be very difficult to balance the needs of the future residents with the existing residents. And as Jonathan Bear said, I think it's going to create a lot of conflicts. And I'm very fearful that there's going to be winners and losers. And I think the winners are going to end up being the developers. And I'm very concerned that the existing residents are going to see their quality of life negatively impacted. So I'll leave my comments at that. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't see any other hands up to speak. Do any of the commissioners have some comments that they would like to make?
I have a couple of questions, if I can ask those.
Yep, yes, please.
Okay, just to make sure I understand, this is for the consultants, how this works, that we have our numbers, it's going to get presumably it will be approved by the state. And then we have until 3 years to basically rezone so we can hit those numbers. Is that kind of correct?
This is Nick Zorn's Development Services Director, so I'm going to be kind of directing some of the questions if needed to the consultants. Yes, your question is really more of a statement. Yes, that's 100% correct, as long as we meet the statutory due date.
Okay, then I have a follow-up. So that's the process. And if we submit the plan, just assume it's the plan that as was presented tonight, we have an excess of housing units. Does that mean we have to rezone as specified in the plan to get to that number? Or if we have a surplus of 200 units, we can kind of pick where we want to rezone and pick what the density is, as long as we make our RENA numbers, not the numbers that were in the housing plan that was approved?
So you're asking if we can essentially rezone differently than what's provided in the plan?
Or not do it all, or do it, yes. Somehow
So-
it's not exactly as
So
laid
this
out
kind
in
of
the plan.
piggybacks a little bit off of what public comment was. The more specific you get in the plan, the more you are guaranteeing what is included within the housing plan that you will accomplish. It is a black and white thing if you put in particulars. So when you say you're going to have increases, or you're going to remove certain standards, or you're going to increase certain standards, by virtue of not putting in a specific number, you then are able to potentially have some flexibility on the back end when you're actually developing the implementing ordinances with the community, which is inevitably what every jurisdiction should want to do, so that you're able to kind of vet things out at a more detailed component. But there are throughout the document, if you look at our programs and the ones that are specific to rezoning, there are some particulars that are called out as minimum modifications to the densities. So for example, I think it's the OA district that we have identified as one of the programs is to rezone with a minimum density of 20 units per acre and a maximum of 30. Now, if we wanted to go higher than that eventually, we could. However, we are locking ourselves into essentially the push of that this is what we're going to do as our minimum for that particular program.
And that's irrespective of if the other rezoning we do has us meet our RENA numbers. It doesn't matter. We still have to do what we specified in the plan.
Yes. So the one big thing, though, that's a big misconception is we have to have a buffer.
Right.
By any means, someone could easily Google is people hit no net loss very easily. So I will give you just a realistic expectation. The lower the buffer, the more probable it is that you will hit a no net loss situation. A previous jurisdiction that I worked for, we obtained housing element certification in 2019. And that the second time that we got the element certified was in 2021. So it was summertime last year. My predecessor from that agency is currently working on adding additional sites to their programs a year and a half later, essentially after adoption and certification, that they're preparing for entitlements of projects that would then trigger no net loss where they need to start doing rezoning next year. So the healthier the buffer, the more wiggle room that we have in the long term to potentially be able to identify future sites if and when we trigger the net loss provisions in the state code.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. And we have to show how we can get to that number. It doesn't mean that the housing has to be built because we can't declare what developers are going to do, right?
Correct. Yeah, we cannot dictate what the private market will yield. So that's why, kind of relating it back to the previous comment and response, was that's why you have a buffer, is because the private market will inevitably dictate exactly what is built. We can obviously finesse it with our regulations and our approvals. However, they could come in with lower density than what we are projecting.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Except on city-owned sites, you can dictate.
Correct. Yes. Anything that city retains, not just land use authority, but the actual property ownership, yes, we would be able to dictate a significant amount of more, guaranteeing ourselves more units or a specific number of units. Yes.
In other jurisdictions, so my concern is when we look at the sites inventory, we have essentially wiped out small business, goods and services, every grocery store that's in our, jurisdiction. But what you're saying is we turn these numbers in as potential sites, doesn't mean they're going to go away, but what's the instance of, some of these sites just going away and not having any small business or, retail within our borders?
So one thing though that I think is a misconception is by no means does any of the programs, as the way that they're facilitated, say that we are going to not allow for commercial uses on identified sites or a part of the rezone. The ability of a lot of the programs that we have developed will allow for us to have significant kind of, I would say, engagement and kind of community negotiation on what do we want to see. We want to still maintain some commercial atmosphere and viability in these zones and at these properties. So you can do that by virtue of creating mixed use zoning districts and allowing for both. Like the OA is a prime example of where you could integrate housing on that site in addition to what's existing or as a part of an overall redevelopment of those properties. And that's just that's a specific example, but it could be applied to any type of zone. I just want to make sure I call on Jolie Houston, the city attorney. She has her hand up.
Oh wait, what did I do? I did.
We can hear you.
Oh, okay. No, I was going back to Commissioner Messenger's questions about the buffer zones and and so we have a buffer zone. We have sites that have been designated with target densities. And I think this might be helpful for the public. So let's say a developer comes in and doesn't build out to the density proposed, we would have to make no net loss findings, correct? And we would have to say that or designate other sites to make up that no net loss. Isn't that how it works? If someone.
So in practice, what I have done, and we can explore specifics in the government code unless Dave or Stefano can clarify if there's been anything recent in the last year that I'm unaware of. We tracked it in prior jurisdictions in order to know essentially the running total. What did we entitle? What are we now down? What's our capacity at? That's now where prior colleagues of mine are now working on. We're getting dangerously close to falling into the white versus the opposite end of the spectrum to the black zone, and the black and white is just we have to then now integrate. We're in that gray zone where we have to go before we trigger it. And so that's what they're working on. And that triggered because they are going to fall below capacity in order to facilitate the RENA if they end up approving all of the entitled projects that are forthcoming that are already under review as of right now. So that's in practice how I know it's done. If one of our consultants.
It's absolutely correct. I mean,
okay.
the government code recognizes that property will not develop in 100% of the income category that's identified. which is why the buffer is recommended, because throughout the entire 8-year cycle, you need to have the capacity to meet your entire obligation under RENA at all income levels. That being said, the buffer, RENA is RENA, buffer is not required, but the guidance recommends between 15 and 30%. I think it's difficult to make 30%, but it is always best practice to have as much of a buffer as you can.
Thank you,
Yeah.
David.
Thank you. And no, I just wanted to clarify that too, because some sites may be designated at a certain density level, and what gets built there may not meet that level. And then we have to rely on the buffer for other, I gotta move my cat, other areas. But it is a sort of shifting pattern, and that's why the buffer is so important.
Yes, correct.
Thanks. Any other comments?
I've got a comment. First of all, I want to thank LWC for I think a great presentation. You put the information together, good explanations of the entire process. I think that I'd like to thank the public for the letters, some of which we have received. Good feedback and the public comments tonight. Two things. Well, let me just continue on that. Shelley just mentioned something about shopping centers and developing part of it. I flash back to a development in Palo Alto on Alma Street that was originally a nice shopping center, a nice Safeway, whatever store it was. And they ultimately developed a bunch of condos or townhouses in the back. And then they put a small grocery store in the front, which has had a terrible time up until the last few years because it's so small and it's economically not very profitable, and it was vacant and so forth. So I think we have to be careful when we're taking the excess land of some of our shopping centers or whatever it be, and make sure that the viability of the commercial does continue. Couple things on the report. On table B7, existing uses on non-vacant lower income sites. And the existing use, you have a typo there. You have a specialty shopping center, and you have Town and Country Village El Paseo de Saratoga. Somebody obviously forgot to put in the village court, which is supposed to be. And that follows up on the identification. You're listing APN numbers and not addresses. Now I know on a previous report you had the addresses, which gives the public an opportunity to see exactly what property it is. You put an APN number and somebody's got to go to a lot of work, additional work, and then find the address. So if I can, a suggestion, put addresses down for the public. I can easily find the APN number, but the public is going to have to go to some work at it. Again, thank you very much. Very happy with the presentation, the information you provided me.
So Commissioner, I will just add is as of today, we have completed adding the addresses to all of the sites that are identified to coincide with the APN. So both will be provided. That was completed at the very end of the day today. It does not change anything substantive within the draft. So there's no kind of reiteration process or need to extend a public comment or review period for that particular provision. But that spreadsheet will be posted. I would suspect if it's already not happened, but since we're on the call right now, sometime tomorrow with that update that includes both APN and addresses. And then formally in the subsequent draft, once we get that returned from HCD, we will be including the addresses, if not before we submit to HCD, when we do get it returned from their 90-day review.
That's great. I think that's great. Not for me, again, for the public. I think it'd make it a lot easier. And I'd like to thank you, Nick. You did a great job in clarification of some of the questions. It's good to have a professional there and clarifying to those areas that are gray to a lot of people. Thanks very much.
And Nick, I think can you guys hear me? I changed my headset. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. But as we discussed, some of these parcels have more than one APN and one address. So there is a little, they're trying.
Oh, Jolie, we can't hear you now. You muted.
No, so just for public awareness that some of these parcels with one address have more than one APN. So when we're trying to combine these APN.
Jolie, you muted again.
Yeah, so anyway, so we're trying to match them up. And so the staff is really trying to do the best they can to get an address to an APN, or sometimes it's multiple APNs that has one address, right? We were talking about that the other day. So
yeah,
it's going to be as consistent as we can. And so trying to make addresses match APNs.
And I understand that. And I think if you maybe put 126, whatever street it is, and maybe 126 plus, so that the person's going by, they can see, oh, that's whatever building it is, and there's a whole shopping center. But thank you very much.
I had a quick question. There were some questions about the draft being too defined or too abstract, and I'm curious where's the best place to be in terms of how ambiguous we should be and how explicit we should be, specifically on certain programs like dissolving the design review commission, or how involved council will be with design projects. I know you mentioned how it works with density and zoning, but with those programs, where's the best place to be at in terms of how it's written in the draft?
So I will say that the way that the draft is written, I think, is as conservative but as proactive as we possibly can be as a jurisdiction when preparing to submit to HCD. So I'm not trying to dance around that question, is that we want to be as specific as we can in order to satisfy statutory requirements, as well as identifying and being realistic with the impediments that we have identified that are in our community, and that we are acknowledging that some things need to be, as I like to say, peeling back the layers in order to make it more realistic and in line with best practices for today's type of development. So with that, I would say from my previous experiences that this is probably a really good and solid first iteration to submit to the state, where they will provide us, especially during this first round review, pretty specific comments if they have issues with how inadequate maybe a program isn't specifying something. I don't think that we're going to probably have that problem significantly in our document, just based on what I think we're submitting is pretty solid. However, it also depends on the review from the state. So, we also need to be cognizant of that. But I think that if they come back with, substantive comments, that's then when we can fold those in. But we need to obtain those comments from a first round review, which that's what this is on the precipice of. And we need to get to that point so we can start getting some real direction for our jurisdiction.
Okay, thank you.
Shelley, I have a question. I think it's for Nick, actually. And that has to do with what happens once we've identified the sites. My understanding is that not only do we have to identify potential sites, that is basically sites where there isn't housing and could be, but there has to be some realistic possibility that there might be development. In other words, we have to present some kind of evidence that the owners of the property at least do not oppose development or whatever it is. Can you address that question of how realistically we have to, or is this too early a stage to be talking about that?
I'm actually going to turn that to our consultant LWC, just because they did touch on that in our presentation. I think with as best as we can address that comment right now, but they can potentially expand unless Jolie, you have something to provide.
It just froze up. No, we can rezone, but we don't need the property owner's permission if we do rezone. And I think that LCW went through that in their PowerPoint. So, I mean, I'll turn it over to LCW because they have more experience with what we all have to do, but we don't have to build but we will need to rezone some
Well, my question
areas.
wasn't about rezoning. My question was really about what HCD's expectation is when it sees the list of properties. Because what we could do in the past was just list anything that was vacant and that was theoretically available. My understanding is they've tightened the requirements up and they want some, and it's not clear to me what that would be. Jolie, I'll use one of our inside terms, scintilla of evidence, to suggest that this might actually happen, as opposed to something that theoretically could possibly maybe sort of, if the wind is right, happen. And so what I'm sort of addressing is the question of HCD's approach to this and what they expect to see. And behind that is the question is, where do we stand in developing this? I know that there's been discussion of church parking lots, for example. Are the churches interested in this? Are the churches not interested in this? What's that part of the process, if that's something we need to worry about at this stage?
I'll let LCW talk to this more completely, but that's part of the site constraints and then the feasibility. And those are all the factors that they look into when they actually designate inventory sites. So they are already looking at vacant or not vacant, or what is the possibility of development happening there. And I'm not sure if it's going to, which LCW person's going to comment on that further.
I have some information. So essentially there are three interrelated but separate concepts related to siting housing on non-vacant land. First, we have to understand the difference between vacant and non-vacant. Vacant has no improvements on it. So a parking lot, surface parking lot, is considered a non-vacant site. So when looking at non-vacant sites, there are a couple of questions that get asked as to whether or not you can attribute housing onto the site. The first is, what is its realistic capacity? The realistic capacity is a recognition that development doesn't fill to 100% of its entitlement. Let me stick a pin in state density bonus applications, because you all know on the Planning Commission that very often you end up approving projects over 100% of their entitlements if they're taking advantage of density bonus. But we're not allowed to count that by the government code that HCD evaluates. So there needs to be some kind of a discount on what the entire envelope of the building is. And this happens because there are restrictions and setbacks or the geometry of the parcel, etc. So we're required to look at comparable developments either in the community, and if there are none in the community, we can go to neighboring communities as far out as the entire county to find examples of comparable developments that develop at a certain capacity of their entitlement. And that number usually falls between 70 and 80% of the realistic capacity of the site. So that's concept number one.
May I interrupt you for just a
Sure.
second? Our code requires development to maximum density.
Right, but there are issues about setbacks and other kinds of issues that a developer might find that the definition of maximum capacity is not the zoning envelope of the parcel.
So let me interrupt and ask one quick thing. If the city got an influx of SB9 applications before we publish these RENA numbers, then how does that count? I mean, does that count?
So SB9 is a separate question, but I'll answer that.
Yeah.
So we had a conversation. So SB9 is new, 6 months old. it went into force in January 1st, 2022. And HCD
It's
ha-
excluded now.
has looked at SB 9 and issued some guidance. The guidance is in a memo. It's actually a little bit different. It has a different force of requirement to follow it, but it gives a guideline to communities as to how they are going to evaluate SB 9. And we had a conversation in one of their office hours that was arranged through ABAG, and they said that there was it required a very high bar of evidence for communities to include SB 9 units in their expectation of meeting their obligation under RENA. They were looking for applications in the pipeline or specific parcels where an SB 9 application was either imminent or underway, so that you had established a track record. They're looking at a little bit like how they look at ADUs. They say you need to look back to 2018, what's your average annual production, and then move forward. The fact that there's only 6 months means that there's very little to no track record that communities can point to. So there's a lot of misconceptions that are floating out there about SB 9. And we are finding, you may find some neighboring communities trying to get one by HCD by saying something along the lines of, well, since there's SB 9, our R1 zone, we think 20% is going to become a SB 2 fourplex. And so that's how we're going to accommodate our RENA. They are very wary of that. And and they have told us they are discouraging communities from relying on SB 9 to meet their allocations under RENA. And they've also told us that they are demanding a very high bar of evidence tied to specific parcels or sites before they will accept SB 9 as having capacity to meet your obligations under RENA.
Okay.
So let me get back to the next concept that's related to this. So we have this idea of realistic capacity. The next question is impediment. So similar but slightly different. So state law now requires that if you look at a non-vacant site, you need to show that the existing uses are not an impediment to reuse over the 8-year cycle. And they statutorily, or in the guidance, they list certain categories of uses that they take as prima facie evidence of being impediments. So that's something that we have to consider. So that's, what are the existing conditions? What are those existing uses? And are those uses impediments for redevelopment of the site over the 8-year cycle? There's a third concept, which is the findings of fact. So on adoption, after the city has received its letter of substantial compliance and gets ready to adopt, the city council needs to have a findings of fact that says, based on evidence, usually it's market evidence that's included in the plan, based on information that has been received from the public outreach process, that they in fact certify or acknowledge that all of the sites that have been identified will be available for redevelopment over the 8-year planning cycle. So those are three concepts that are close together, a little bit different in how they're implied, but can get quickly conflated in sort of the community's mind as saying, well, you have to prove that the use would go away before it would be a site, but that's not the standard. Okay. I hope that, I really feel bad about this because I like communicating in plain language to people about complex things about planning. Housing elements have gotten to the point where we're not able to talk about them in plain language. And I feel bad about that. This is confusing technical stuff for people.
Yeah, thank you. That was a comment I was thinking about while you were presenting earlier, that, it's, wish we could simplify it.
It wouldn't be any fun if we were able to simplify it.
Are there any other comments or questions before we move on? And
Chair, excuse me, I might jump into Commissioner Steinley's question if I'm saying your name correctly.
Yes.
Table B5 in Appendix B.
Yes.
Outlines the different residential development capacity assumptions as well in terms of what those numbers are by zoning district and how those are being calculated, either the discount of the maximum allowable density or some kind of discount based on average development trends. So that's another resource there for you.
Well, my concern was what we have to give the state. I'm not concerned about how we're going to do it. I'm concerned about how the state's going to say yes to us and what we have to provide. Okay. That's my question.
Yeah, and I would say, that as David mentioned, the city's obligation is to meet RENA, and the city's close to that, given what it has already in its zoning code and what the zoning code already allows. But then to Nick's point earlier on no net loss, that healthy buffer that the rezoning provides, makes it that much easier for the state to go for this plan. Of course, specifics and edits and all that will be worked out through the HCD review process. But in terms of what the numbers look like right now, you're close with the existing zoning, and then that rezoning provides a healthy buffer that I think that the state's going to like to see, and will make things easier down the road for the city to meet its no net loss obligations.
got it. Great, thank you. Any other comments? I don't see any. Let's see. Well, we can close this open public hearing on this on state housing, and really appreciate all the comments from the public and having the public listen in, and of course, really speak up, send letters, watch the housing website, make sure your voice is heard. And thank you again. There'll be other public hearings. This will go to city council. You'll have another opportunity to speak. We appreciate it.
And Chair, I'll just take one
yes.
quick second just
Sure.
for the folks that are left on the call. I see some frequent flyers that I've actually talked to already in the community, and thank you for attending tonight. However, for those that I have not met or helped kind of reconcile and navigate our draft document, I'm boots on the ground here at City Hall nearly every single day. I welcome the calls, the emails, and also impromptu visits like I had with 2 residents yesterday for 45 minutes. However, I help them understand, and what I like to say is have the housing element be a digestible document that they're able to actually somewhat grasp the understanding of what its intention is, and what we're actually saying we're going to do. So with that is the folks that are on the call, definitely my direct email is on the city's website under the Community Development Department homepage. By any means, please stop by the City Hall or reach out to set up a meeting or a call. I am available to be able to find time to meet with the community residents. And I know that's audacious sometimes, but thankfully I'm not the director of the city of San Francisco or Los Angeles with a population much larger than ours. So I feel like it's a realistic thing to be able to start accomplishing and really starting to help educate our community on the housing element process. Obviously might not agree with it, but I definitely want to help folks understand what the document actually has contained inside of it and how it's actually applied in our community now and in the future. So please, anybody that's on the call, feel free to reach out.
Sure. Thank you, Nick. That's
And-
really generous. It's a very scary, it's kind of a scary document because it affects people's, property rights. It affects their values, and it's very difficult to understand what does this mean for me in the future. So I appreciate that.
Sorry, Shelley, I had one last
Sure.
comment on, before we go, I just wanted to discuss the downtown parking situation, because in the draft there's programs that talk about the 2 parking plazas for development projects, and then I think later on, there's another program that talks about just refining the parking plan. I think that part of it should be including a downtown parking garage, and it doesn't say that specifically, but I think that that should be part of it. So I also think it's important for us to be strategic how we're going to sequence it, because you know, I've always said that a downtown parking garage, you know, a 4 or 5 level garage for the CRS property specifically, would create a legitimate system for those zones to add housing, and it's a no-brainer. And I think that there's an argument to be made that that type of endeavor would actually be more effective in the short term than selling the parking plazas for a development project.
Yeah.
And so, you know, because I don't think the CRS properties are going to be able to ever add housing if there's not a parking system like a garage. And so my point is that I think we should have something in there that talks about what is priority 1, what's priority 2, and how to be strategic about it, because the way it's written, I don't want it to have it be that everything's happening all at once, and we're not thinking about the order of how this is going to go. Because maybe it could happen together. Maybe, you know, we sell a parking plaza and then use that funding to build the parking garage for the CRS, or maybe some other combination. But I just think we need to have some type of language in there. That was just something that just caught my eye with the parking.
Thank you, Mary. That's a great suggestion. And, you know, there could be public-private partnership under that new development. We see those all over the Bay Area now, especially for parking. You know, look to the neighboring Palo Alto for that. It's an excellent suggestion. Great, thank you. Well, seeing that there is no other comment from the public, I'm going to close this public hearing and thank everybody again for their input and patience tonight. And thanks LWC for that report. And I'm going to move on to the next item, which is the commissioners' reports and any comments from the commissioners. Do we have any reports from any of the commissioners on any meetings? I don't see any. All right, any potential future agenda items? Now, like we don't have a full agenda for the next few months. Steve, any comments on that?
Well, we will have a meeting in 2 weeks. We are supposed to be hearing the 4350 El Camino Real project. That got continued from the last meeting because we didn't have a quorum. So if commissioners, if you're not going to be present for the meeting, we definitely need to know about that well ahead of the meeting so we can know.
Eric has to recuse himself from that one.
Yeah. That's correct.
Is there anything else on the agenda for that evening, or is that it?
We will be also, I think, tentatively scheduled as to discuss SB 9 development objective standards again. The minutes were sent out and are included in this meeting from the previous meeting that was discussed, and so that could possibly be back on the agenda again. Unfortunately, right now, the planning division is a bit short-staffed, so we are trying our best to keep up with all the items that we have on our plate and keep everything moving forward, but those are the 2 potential items right now.
Great, thank you. Okay, seeing nothing else, move to adjourn. Second. Great, thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, great meeting.
Great meeting, thanks. See you in 2 weeks.